This is the beginning of the 7th recorded lecture here in Human Anatomy Phys BI 252, spring of 2022. This is the beginning of information for lecture exam 2. A reminder to take a look at the syllabus to keep all of this straight. For lecture exam 2, it is this series of lectures about the respiratory system that's on lecture exam 2, and also chapter 26, parts of chapter 26 related to nutrition and metabolism that builds on the digestive system information that is for lecture exam 1. Let's take a look at this highly branching system on the left and highly branching system on the right. Can you recognize what each is? Along the left is the series of highly branching tubules called bronchi, bronchioles, that deliver air from the larynx down into the alveoli, which is the respiratory surface of the human respiratory tract. So this is human respiratory tract color-coded. On the right is a root system. It's a root system of course, some kind of little tree. And both of them are highly branched, and both of them have tremendous amounts of surface area for the exchange of important materials. Of course, on the left, it's about the exchange of respiratory gases, and that would be primarily oxygen and carbon dioxide. On the right, buried in the soil, absorbing moisture here, and perhaps other nutrients and gases just as well. So this is what they have in common. Here we're looking at an actual dissection of, and probably a digestion away of the alveoli, so that this is just, again, the delivery system. This is like thinking about the ductwork within a building that's bringing in fresh air from the outside, or heated or air-conditioned air. This requires quite a lot of special preparation and digestion away of then most of the respiratory surfaces, and those are the alveoli. So as we get going here, I want to do some introductory things that may or may not be in the textbook, so a little warning about that. This chapter 22 on the respiratory system is very direct in the chapter. And I think it should be something that's pretty easy to understand. I'm going to introduce a number of things that aren't in the textbook, and so be prepared for that. Although I do generally follow the structure of the textbook, I'm bringing in some additional things, especially in this particular chapter. Now, if you take a look at figure 22.3, and I don't have it right here, that figure, parts of the respiratory and digestive system, are on the first lab exam. So we have a sagittal section of the head, a model of that for you to look at, and I hope you have started looking at that. You perhaps are listening to this lecture after you're done with or finished lecture exam 1. That would be logical. Hopefully, you're listening to this before the lab exam on the digestive system. So the question is, why do we have a respiratory system? Okay. Well, it actually is a little deeper answer than you might have just answered with, and maybe in your mind, thinking, well, we need oxygen. Why? Well, most of our metabolism uses oxygen, directly or indirectly, and to make ATP, we need that kind of support. So we call that, okay, so think about this, aerobic or anaerobic? Aerobic or anaerobic? And the answer is it's aerobic if it involves oxygen. Okay. So our body needs ATP, and most synthesis of ATP, the most efficient synthesis of ATP, uses oxygen and generates carbon dioxide. Glycolysis does not use oxygen and generates ATP, but it does not at all generate the quantities that we need to survive. So we could not survive without oxygen, and of course, anytime a person's had their oxygen supply cut off, like drowning, then that person is expected to die. So, why do we have a respiratory system? Because we need ATP, and because to make ATP most efficiently requires oxygen and generates carbon dioxide. But if you think about it, and if you had zoology with me, and chances are you did, earthworms, the kind of things that are crawling around in the ground, and it's not spring yet, so we don't have spring rains and worms on the sidewalks. But those earthworms do not have lungs or gills. So how do they accomplish this? And the answer is largely they do not have the kind of ATP requirements that we do, because we maintain a very high body temperature and they don't. And second of all, they're small and they have a moist body surface. But axolotls, on the other hand, have both lungs and gills, and yet they do not maintain a high, steady body temperature. So what's going on here? And this is one of our Blackburn College floaters that we first discovered in, well, myself and another student, Lou Brown, who was helping to raise the axolotls at the time. We discovered this trait, and then the next 4 years, several of my students, Betsy Pocklington and Chris Maxon, helped to describe this trait, and then we got to name it. This is one of those floaters who's inflated his lungs, and for whatever reason, we still haven't figured it out, he can't exhale. This air is in their lungs, it is not in the coelomic cavity. So it's actually, you can see it, and anatomically it's in their lungs. In any case, they have both lungs and gills. So why are we more like axolotls than earthworms? And the answer is because we're vertebrates, and we have generally a higher rate of metabolism, although axolotls don't. And we need to exchange those gases efficiently. So here in figure 22.1 in your textbook, the 8th edition, it's also in the 7th, probably in the 9th, is a common figure that helps to diagram out just the basics. Okay. So a few things you should notice on this diagram right away. Notice the pleural cavity is the cavity which contains the lungs. Okay. Within this, we had talked about the mediastinum, which actually collectively encloses the trachea and the esophagus and these blood vessels and the heart. You guys, yesterday, so I'm recording this on the 27th of January, so on the 25th and 26th, different lab sections, you were first opening up your cat. Here's the diaphragm, and you're making cuts, I hope, just cranial to the diaphragm and just caudal to the diaphragm. Okay? And so cranial to the diaphragm, you're going to have a variety of cavities. We have the pleural cavity. Within the mediastinum, you'll have the pericardial cavity. Peri means around, and cardia is, of course, then the heart. Okay. So, what is our respiratory system? It's a series of pathways that's allowing us to exchange gases, that is, oxygen generally in and CO2 generally out, with our environment. Okay. Now, getting oxygen in to our lungs is only the start of the important function of the respiratory system. The respiratory system cannot deliver that oxygen efficiently to our arms and our legs and even our lower abdomen and, of course, our brain. So, the respiratory system simply must work hand in hand with the cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular system then is helping to move these gases around, and when we get to the cardiovascular system, which follows our look at the respiratory system, we're going to look real deeply at how gases are transported in blood, but we'll wait until we get there. But of course, we're delivering in the cardiovascular system oxygen to the tissues, and carbon dioxide is removed. So, collectively, putting together the respiratory system and the circulatory system, it becomes the cardiopulmonary system. And this is one of those systems that has to be up and functioning well and healthy for you to be an active athlete, or really even an active person, an active human being. So, a little clarification of terminology. And this really is a big problem, because we'll hear the word respiration and it's confusing, because there's cellular respiration and then there's organismal respiration. Respiration broadly can mean simply ventilation of the lungs. That means moving gases in and out of the lungs, or you might know it as breathing. In other contexts, like cell biology, you might explore all sorts of things that are going on inside of a cell, and those are collectively called cellular metabolism. But cellular respiration, just as well, is something that's involving mitochondria. Okay, so cellular metabolism includes cellular respiration, aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration. You would have looked at what's going on in mitochondria, in which we have the use of oxygen, and you also have looked at what's going on in the cytosol, which is glycolysis. So it's confusing. What do we mean by respiration? We're talking about the whole body, or we're talking about what's occurring inside of a cell? You got to make sure you're clear about that, and make sure you know what are we talking about when you hear these conversations. On page 846 is this long list of functions of the respiratory system. One of the things that's important about these recorded lectures, especially when we come upon these figures that I'm about to show you of anatomy, is that you can pause this lecture at any given time and look in detail at something that's on the screen. So here are 8 functions of the respiratory system, and I'm not going to bother going through all of them. You can read them. They're right there for you. Okay? But the respiratory system does a lot for us. Okay? How about the anatomy? Well, we just finished looking at the digestive system, and we noticed that there were some common aspects of the respiratory and digestive systems. So see if you can think of, what did the digestive system, our analysis of the digestive system, the anatomy, and also our lectures in chapter 25, what parts of our look at the digestive system involve the respiratory? You could pause right now and give some thought to that. But as I think about this, right away I come up with this list. You know that the pharyngeal regions, places where we could choke, are places where these two systems overlap. Functionally, they're both involved in the sense of taste. We talked about that in Human Anatomy Phys 1. You can breathe through your nose and mouth, and of course, we generally bring food in through our mouth. Sneezing involves both. And I don't know if you've thought about when you're making sound with your voice. Some people have a more nasal voice, where they're helping to form most of the sound through resonation in their nose, which generally is not desired in singers. A lot of nasal kind of sounds. Okay. Instead, in singing, especially my 2 children who've been trained in singing, there's a lot more shaping of the mouth and where you make sounds, deep in the throat or out here on the tips of your lips. Perhaps you can notice some differences in the sounds of my voice as I'm trying to make the point that our nose and mouth are both involved in making sounds, and certainly in singing. This is important. Next question. Still haven't left the digestive system conversation. Why do you think we studied digestive before the respiratory system? The answer is, developmentally, lungs are derived from the digestive tract. And so here's a figure not in your book at all. This is actually from the textbook in developmental biology, and that's BI 404. I hope you get a chance to take that class. I'm going to be gone, but I hope you get a chance to take it and have a really good course because it's so fundamental. Developmental biology is simply enough a class that addresses the subject of becoming. What is development? Well, it's how we get to be ourselves as adults. How did that come about? And further, the broad category of development in this class also includes things like regeneration and stem cells, which are involved in medicine, and cancer, and so many other related topics. Back to the fundamentals. Developmental biology, or an embryology course, would help you to understand that first the foregut forms, and then a branch forms off of the foregut on the ventral side. So you can feel your trachea on your neck. So if you reach up to your neck and feel for little kind of bumpy areas, and if you hum, you feel a lot of vibration. That's this tracheal system that's starting to form, and it's on the ventral side or anterior side of the human body. Initially forms as an outpocketing and then becomes branched, and then these branches are going to develop into the elaborate bronchial system that I was hinting at or showing you a little bit at as we got started, and then of course ending in the respiratory surfaces called the alveoli. So here a little bit more developmental biology, showing you at the very beginning, over here on the left of the head end of the digestive tract. Down here is, the pancreas is going to develop. This is going to be the future intestine. That's what these labels are showing you. And then right here is this ventral projection that's going to form the bronchial system, the lungs, and the respiratory surfaces, the alveoli. And here they're showing you in a different way, and here an early stage of the development of the lungs. So why did we cover digestive tract first? Well, because in my training, in my experience, digestive tract forms first, respiratory then forms from it. The next question that I've just asked flashed on the screen. Why do you think things evolve this way? Why do you think our development occurs this way? Well, first we have a digestive tract, if we look at our ancestors, and they're in water. And then there's an emergence of vertebrates onto land. That's those wonderful amphibians. And as they emerged onto land, a secondary respiratory system, other than gills, lungs have evolved. And so lungs came off of the digestive tract. We think that in lungfish, we already have lungs coming off of the digestive tract, lungs that are supplementing respiration and also involved in buoyancy. So, why do we think that we see a respiratory system derived from the digestive? Because many, many early vertebrates simply had a digestive system, and the respiratory system did not involve lungs, it involved gills. Secondarily, and later, we see the evolution of lungs. So, an overview here still. What are the basics about the parts of our respiratory system? Well, here you go. Nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. So, nose, obviously, pharyngeal regions. Then up here, the larynx associated, it's the entranceway into the respiratory tract proper. It's where air is separated then from the path to the stomach, which is the esophagus back here. Then finally down to the trachea, and then bronchioles that are branching into the lungs, delivering to smaller and smaller regions, which have higher and higher surface to volume ratios. The air is terminating in the alveoli, and that's these little very thin sacs where gas exchange actually occurs. The rest of the respiratory system is about transport, moving these gases in and out, towards and away from the alveoli. So upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. Upper respiratory tract, as it says on the screen, largely head and neck, nose down through the larynx, so where you're making your vocalizations, where you're drawing air into then the transport directly to the lungs, separated then from the transport to the digestive tract. The rest of the digestive tract, I should say. Lower respiratory tract then is farther down. It's pretty much right here, trachea through the lungs. Maybe you've heard, clinically, people talk about an upper respiratory tract infection and a lower respiratory tract infection. Here in January of 2022, Omicron is a major concern. We are peaking still in Illinois, perhaps just on the cusp of seeing declines that we all hope for. That's certainly the case. It looks like the Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID disease, Delta variant was causing more lower respiratory tract infections. It looks like Omicron is more associated with upper respiratory tract infections. So, even this distinction is involved in COVID. If you got a sneezy nose, a cough, a little bit of a cough, and you're raspy, your voice, maybe you got a sore throat, that's much more of an upper respiratory tract infection. That may lead to a lower respiratory tract infection, which you have much more problems expelling mucus. Some of that mucus may be discolored, maybe a greenish yellow kind of mucus that's coming out of a lower respiratory tract infection. And lower respiratory tract infections can be much more of an issue with getting sufficient gas exchange. Now for some of these really, really nice images. And right here, you can see a bit of a coronal section, so that means we're separating out anterior from posterior sides of the body, and we're taking a look inside these nasal cavities. This is the beginning now of images that I have on this recorded lecture that I'm really happy to have, because this would not be the case if we were live. But you can pause at any point here on the video, and I hope you do, and notice these specific regions that are highlighted in, I don't know, I'm going to call this kind of a teal color here. And so look really closely, and here's the label, and then here shows you that particular region when you're taking a look at this frontal section. And these can be difficult to appreciate, especially if you don't have these kinds of special coronal sections. So I'm delighted that we have the recorded lectures and some very special images that you now can look at your own pace and appreciate the anatomy. Sagittal sections are much more common ways of representing the respiratory tract, and I think we do that because it's a good distinction between the digestive routes and the respiratory routes divided by the secondary palate. Here, just as well, you can pause at any time and look at these anatomical depictions a little bit better, and here just as well. So feel free, and I hope you do, stop so you can be clear about where these anatomical regions are. I'm going to point out some basic stuff about the anatomy. I'm going to leave the details really to lab, and the textbook does a great job. So as I say in C right here on the screen, all the anatomy in the textbook is assigned regarding chapter 22, and it's part of the general assignment. Now let's have a little fun. Feel your nose, if you will, and go up and down your nose and see if you can find clearly where there's bone. And the answer is, it's about where eyeglasses rest. So if you're wearing sunglasses, if you don't have prescription lenses, and you wear sunglasses, it's where those typically rest on the nose. And that's the very firm nasal bone that I hope you remember from Human Anatomy Phys 1. If you haven't had Human Anatomy Phys 1, or you're going to need to retake it, do glance over and look at a skull. And when you look at a human skull, a complete one, you'll notice that the nose looks funky. And the reason is because on a completed human skull, we don't include cartilage. So the tip of the nose is missing and the ears are missing. And that's part of why a skull looks so weird. Of course, all the soft flesh, that is the skin, the underlying connective tissues, and the musculature is missing just as well. So what else gives your nose shape? And the answer is cartilage. Just one piece of cartilage? Well, this is figure 22, found on page 847 of the 8th edition. Here you can see a person's nose, and then they show you in the second part of this figure all the different types of cartilage. And in fact, if you were a plastic surgeon working on people's faces, oh my goodness, would you know this backwards and forwards? Notice the nasal bone up here. Notice lots of pieces of cartilage. And notice also that the little flared part of your nostrils don't have cartilage. So here, all those cartilages pieces are all labeled. And notice that one of them is unpaired. Which one? Which one doesn't have a left and right? And it looks like it's the septal nasal cartilage. So now feel right down from your nasal bones and right down the very, very center. And you've got a single piece right there. But then when you get to the tip of your nose, you have these two bigger pieces, the major alar cartilages right here. So Michael Jackson was kind of famous for having his nose reshaped. And plastic surgeons clearly could have gone in and if he wanted his nose smaller, they could have shaved down some of these pieces of cartilage and reshaped things here in other different ways. I don't know how they're going to shape the nostrils a little bit. Maybe they're even going to put in wire or some other kind of structural device. So more really, really good images. Here's a skull, taking a look at the nasal septum and also the conchi. Remember the nasal conchi? The conchi are really, really thin bones that are highly convoluted, that are forming these highly folded respiratory surfaces. Here, again, invite you to stop anytime. Here you can see in the skull some of these air spaces that are really sort of dead ends of a cave. And of course, swelling in these particular areas can cause, so if you got allergies or maybe there was some smoke or dust in the area that's irritated your respiratory pathway, these are the areas that really could cause an awful lot of pain. And sinus headaches really can be some of the worst headaches. So I have a great deal of sympathy that suffer from those. I suffer from migraines, and those are bad enough. So, a little bit about the nose anatomy. The vestibule is the very, very beginning of your nose, your nostril. It's the part, the opening that we see when we look at someone's face. Okay? Here the head's tilted back and we can see clearly up there. If you're doing any kind of medical exam, people routinely look into the respiratory pathway here and look into the vestibule and deeper. And you might insert a little scope in there. Know that this is a regular part of medicine to examine and make sure things are okay. There should be a good amount of symmetry associated with your nose, but there could be all sorts of problems where the septum here could be out of shape or funky and change airflow and disrupt airflow. Okay? So all sorts of problems that you may or may not have been diagnosed with. Those are the vestibules. The very, very outer edge, it's stratified squamous epithelium. We're going to see pseudostratified as we go deeper and deeper into the nasal cavity. The nose hairs sticking out of your nose, and it's a lifelong sort of thing. Maybe when you're younger, you don't really notice it too much, but as people get older, we have longer and longer nose hairs that might be sticking out of your face. If you have a mustache, they might even become part of your mustache. For me, I'll just tell you, they tickle. And So it's always a perennial problem with me sort of wiping my nose or brushing my nose because it tickles. Why do we have these nose hairs? Think about it. What do you think that those nose hairs are doing for us? What's been the adaptive advantage? Why has it been that people that have these nose hairs have been more likely to survive and to reproduce? And perhaps you thought about this. It's blocking insects, any other kind of critter, it's got to be a small critter, from going up your nose, and of course it's beginning the filtering process. Just beyond the vestibule, the nasal cavity expands. It doesn't have a lot of open space, it's highly folded. And again, those places are shaped by the nasal conchae. But before we go on, is this really a thing? And I gotta tell you, this isn't attractive to me. But I understand people are experimenting and changing and having fun with their appearance. Not for me. Not for me. Okay, nasal conchae, right here. And here they're labeled. The nasal conchae are these kinds of folds, superior, middle, and inferior. The narrowness and the folded shapes allow then for a high amount of surface area in contact with the air as it goes into and out of our bodies, into and out of the nostrils. On a cold day, and it's not that cold today, it finally got above freezing, but we got some snow this morning. In any case, on a cold day, breathing in through your nose is adaptive. Why? Because it warms and moisturizes the air before it's going to hit your lungs, before it's going to hit those alveoli. Breathing out through your nose then also conveys moisture to this area and also some heat. That heat would then be used to warm up and transferred to the incoming air. And so breathing in and out of your nose on a cold day is a good idea. Now, my wife and I like to take really long walks, and we've already taken our 14th walk of the year, 2.5 miles long in January. We go out when it's cold, dogs go out with us, and when we walk, we struggle with our nose running. And maybe that happens with you. You always got sniffles. And that's because as we're breathing in and out through our nose, our response, our physiological response, is to produce more mucus up here. And such a large amount of mucus even starts to fall out your face, fall out your nose. So one of the things we do, and I don't know, maybe this is gross, maybe you do it as well, is that we will stop maybe about halfway in our walk and we'll tilt our heads back like we're trying to look up into the sky. And that actually allows this extra mucus to run back here down our throat. And so we can kind of drain this area. But if you're leaning forward at all and you're breathing in and out through your nose, you're likely to get that extra mucus accumulating in the front of your sinuses and nasal area, and it's more likely to sort of drip out your nose. So tilting your head back occasionally can help. So what's going on? All of this mucus within the spaces surrounded by the nasal conchae helps to, of course, clean, filter the air, warm it, and moisturize it. Here are some more great images helping you to appreciate these nasal conchae, the great folds. But because they're kind of deep in there, it's anatomy you know about, but you don't usually see. Here, another series of images of the sagittal section of a real human cadaver, and you can pause anytime to take a look at it. Here's some information we talked about in Human Anat Phys 1, certainly when I talked about the olfactory system. Here we see the end of the olfactory nerves, so the olfactory bulb, and then some of these nerves coming off. Those are, of course, detecting odors within the nasal area. You can read a little bit about what's on the screen. We talked about it being a pseudostratified epithelium. and we talked about the binding of various odor molecules. I'm not going to go into much more detail here anatomically. It's important to remind yourself that the sense of smell is here too. So just some more really good figures that you can use to study and pause anytime. A little trivia. You remember the names and numbers? By the way, these are plural. What cranial nerves, plural, and what are the numbers, are associated with smelling? Well, the olfactory nerve we already said, and that's nerve number 1. But there was another nerve involved in the sense of smell. And interestingly, I don't think you're going to find this nerve listed in your textbook, which is just crazy because we've known about this cranial nerve for over 100 years. Why on earth is cranial nerve 0 not listed? I'd have to look it up, see whether or not Saladin includes this at all, but we include it in our lab manual. That's then, I hope, something that you've purchased or somehow acquired for use in the lab. And the answer is cranial nerve 0, called the nervus terminalis. That's also involved in the sense of smell. How does a nasal cavity remove dust? Well, we said already it traps it in this mucus in the nasal cavity. Well, that's good. Cilia are motile. They're covered with mucus. The mucus traps debris, so if you breathe in a lot of dust, let's say you're in the kitchen and you're using flour and you're sifting flour and it kind of bubbles up into the air and you get a little cloud and you breathe it in, you might even sneeze. Where that flour, in my story here, gets trapped is on that mucus, not the cilia. The cilia are within the mucus layer, and the cilia move the mucus. Okay? The cilia propel the mucus posteriorly. And then what? That's really my point. And then what? Where does the dirty mucus go? So, we're all going to clear our throat. Really want you to do it. I just did. And after I clear my throat, I swallowed. And that's the answer. That's where the dirty mucus goes. It goes down into our stomach, eventually. It goes down the esophagus into our stomach. And it's our digestive juices that hopefully help to break down whatever it was that was contained in that mucus. So here's what that respiratory mucosa looks like. So these are the goblet cells that are producing an awful lot of mucus. And then these are the pseudostratified epithelia. And it's pseudostratified because it's not really truly stratified, but the layers of the nuclei look like there's a lower layer and it looks like there's an upper layer, but it's not. All the cells touch the basal lamina down here. So here's one of these really nice figures that helps to pull everything out like this. I'm just delighted by these images. I'm also happy that we're recording these lectures, although I'm unhappy that we're not together. I really love being in person with you guys and helping interact with you and make this a little bit more lively. But you wouldn't get a recording of the PowerPoints and a chance to study these images. So, like everything in life, there's good and bad. Now some nose trivia. You ready? So this is something I'm about to talk about that maybe you've noticed, maybe you've wondered about it. And then keep reading on the screen. So here we go. I was just having a little fun. Have you ever noticed that one nostril is more open than the other? In fact, it seems to switch back and forth. If you're going to sleep, you might notice that one's more open than the other. You might even reposition yourself to try to lay on one side, maybe with the closed one up to sort of get the other side open. Anybody had this happen? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Wow. Turns out this is a normal adaptation. This is a normal thing. This is a thing. Inside the nasal cavity, there is erectile tissue, just like in a nipple, just like in a penis, just like in a clitoris. So there's erectile tissue which swells with blood and it reduces airflow. Why? By the way, this happens about every 30 to 60 minutes. And so there's a preponderant flow of air shifting between the right and left nostrils once or twice an hour. Why is this adaptive? What do you think? In your textbook notes that having one side that's more open than the other allows a recovery on each side from drying that might take a little more time. So the argument is if you had both nostrils wide open, it would continue to dry out each side and they may not stay sufficiently moist. But if you alternate, it gives one side of your nose sort of a half an hour to produce more mucus and recover. I don't know. I don't know if people have done experiments on this to test this hypothesis, but it's not bad. And now you know. You're welcome. How about the pharynx? Well, we just did this in chapter 25. You'll notice or remember that there were different regions of the pharynx, right? So here we go, right here on the screen. The whole pharyngeal region, got nasopharynx, part of the respiratory tract that matters, and then oropharynx and laryngopharynx, in which we're going to have some overlap, some mixing between the pathways for digestion and the pathways for the respiratory system. And this ends right now, this 7th lecture. We're going to pick up and start again when we look at the larynx. So this is the end of lecture 7.